Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are a wide receiver in the National Football League. You have trained your entire life for this. You have sacrificed everything. Your body is a finely tuned machine built for catching footballs in traffic. Now imagine running a route across the middle of the field. Your eyes are locked on the quarterback. The ball is spiraling toward you. Your hands are ready. The catch is there for the taking. But somewhere in your peripheral vision, you see movement. Something is coming. Not someone, something. A shadow that moves faster than physics should allow. A force that does not want to tackle you. A presence that wants to end you. You know who it is before you see his face. Number 43, Oakland Raiders, George Atkinson. And in the half second before impact, you understand something with absolute clarity. This is going to hurt more than anything has ever hurt before. The National Football League has seen violent players throughout its history. It has seen men who hit hard, men who played with aggression, men who intimidated opponents with their physicality. George Atkinson was different. George Atkinson did not play football, he waged war. Every game was a battlefield. Every opponent was an enemy combatant. Every collision was an opportunity to inflict damage that would last long after the final whistle. Receivers who played against the Oakland Raiders in the 1970s did not fear losing the game. They feared losing their careers. They feared losing their ability to remember their own names. They feared George Atkinson. And that fear was completely justified. George Atkinson was born on January 4, 1947, in Savannah, Georgia. From childhood, something burned inside him that other children did not possess. A rage that could not be extinguished, a competitive fire that bordered on pathological, a need to dominate that went beyond normal athletic ambition. He attended Morris Brown College in Atlanta, where he played both football and ran track. His speed was exceptional, his instincts were elite, but his defining characteristic was something that could not be measured by stopwatches or combine drills. George Atkinson wanted to hurt people. Not injure them accidentally, not hit them as a byproduct of good defense. Hurt them deliberately, systematically, memorably. The Oakland Raiders of the 1970s were unlike any team professional football had ever seen. Owner Al Davis had constructed a roster specifically designed to terrify opponents. He collected players that other teams considered too dangerous, too unpredictable, too violent for professional sports. The secondary became known as the Soul Patrol. George Atkinson, Jack Tatum, Skip Thomas, Willie Brown. 4 men who turned the defensive backfield into a torture chamber.
Receivers who entered their territory did not just risk incompletions. They risked concussions, broken bones, shortened careers, permanent neurological damage. And George Atkinson was the most feared among them. His technique was simple and devastating. He did not aim for the football. He aimed for the head. He did not try to separate receiver from ball. He tried to separate receiver from consciousness. The rules of the era permitted contact that would result in immediate ejection and suspension today. Helmet-to-helmet hits were legal. Launching at defenseless receivers was legal. Targeting the head of a player focused on catching the ball was legal. George Atkinson exploited every loophole with sadistic precision. The hit that changed everything happened on September 12, 1976. The Oakland Raiders versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. This was not just a football game. This was a war between the two most physical teams in professional sports. The hatred between these franchises was genuine. Players from both sides despised each other with intensity that went beyond competition. Pittsburgh wide receiver Lynn Swan was having an excellent game. He was beating coverage. He was making catches. He was helping the Steelers move the football against a Raiders defense that took pride in destroying opponents. George Atkinson was watching, waiting. A play developed where Lynn Swan was not the primary target. The ball went elsewhere. Swan was jogging through the secondary, no longer involved in the action. And then George Atkinson struck from behind, without warning, with maximum violence. His forearm crashed into the back of Lynn Swan's head with force that made the entire stadium gasp. Swan crumpled to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. His body went limp. His eyes rolled back. He lay motionless on the turf while medical personnel rushed toward him. The hit was not a football play. It was an assassination attempt disguised as defense. Lynn Swan suffered a severe concussion. He would miss significant time. He would never fully trust his safety on a football field again. The psychological damage lasted longer than the physical wounds, and George Atkinson walked away without penalty. The aftermath of the Lynn Swan hit ignited a firestorm that consumed the entire NFL. Pittsburgh head coach Chuck Noll held a press conference that became legendary for all the wrong reasons. He was asked about the hit. He was asked about George Atkinson. He was asked about the violence that had become synonymous with the Oakland Raiders. Chuck Noll responded with words that would lead to a courtroom. He said there was a criminal element in the NFL. He named George Atkinson specifically. He accused him of being part of a criminal conspiracy to injure opposing players. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. A Hall of Fame coach had publicly called a professional athlete a criminal. He had accused him of deliberately trying to end careers. He had suggested that George Atkinson belonged in prison rather than on a football field. George Atkinson did something that nobody expected. He hired a lawyer. The defamation lawsuit filed by George Atkinson against Chuck Noll became the most sensational legal battle in NFL history to that point. A football player was suing a football coach for calling him a criminal. The case went to trial in 1977. Attorneys argued about the nature of football violence. Witnesses testified about the culture of intimidation that defined the sport. Experts debated whether George Atkinson's tactics crossed the line from aggressive to criminal.
The courtroom became a stage where the soul of professional football was examined under oath. Chuck Noll was forced to defend his comments. He was forced to explain why he believed George Atkinson was a criminal. He was forced to justify public statements that had damaged another man's reputation. And then the jury delivered its verdict. George Atkinson won. Not completely. The damages awarded were minimal. $1 in compensatory damages, nothing punitive. But the symbolic victory was enormous. A jury of ordinary citizens had declared that Chuck Noll was wrong to call George Atkinson a criminal. They had rejected the narrative that he was a thug who did not belong in professional sports. They had validated his right to play football the way he chose to play it. George Atkinson walked out of that courtroom with something more valuable than money. He walked out with vindication. The NFL could not ignore what was happening. George Atkinson and the Raiders had exposed an uncomfortable truth about professional football. The violence that made the sport popular was also making it dangerous beyond acceptable limits. Players were being carried off fields with injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Commissioner Pete Rozelle faced pressure from owners, coaches, and the public to do something. He implemented new rules specifically designed to stop George Atkinson. Penalties for hitting defenseless receivers were increased. Fines for flagrant fouls were raised dramatically. Officials were instructed to watch the Raiders' secondary with extra scrutiny. The NFL was trying to legislate George Atkinson out of the game. It did not work. George Atkinson adapted. He found new ways to inflict pain within the adjusted rules. He continued to terrorize receivers who dared to enter his territory. He remained the most feared player in professional football despite everything the league did to stop him. You cannot legislate fear. You cannot write rules that eliminate a predator. George Atkinson was a force of nature that the NFL could slow but never stop.
The question that halted opponents was simple. Why? Why did George Atkinson play with such violence? Why did he seem to enjoy inflicting pain? Why did he cross lines that other players respected? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about professional football. George Atkinson understood the game better than his critics. He understood that football is not actually about scoring touchdowns. It is about imposing your will on another human being. It is about making your opponent fear you so completely that they cannot perform their job. A receiver who is worried about getting hit cannot focus on catching the football. A quarterback who is worried about his receiver getting destroyed cannot throw with confidence. An offense that is worried about physical survival cannot execute its game plan. George Atkinson weaponized fear more effectively than any player in NFL history. His violence was not random, it was strategic. Every brutal hit sent a message to every other player on the opposing roster. Cross into my territory and you will pay a price that no victory is worth. Teams changed their entire offensive philosophies to avoid George Atkinson. They stopped throwing over the middle. They stopped sending receivers into his zone. They sacrificed portions of the field because the cost of challenging him was too high. That is not thuggery.
That is dominance at its purest form. The men who played with George Atkinson speak about him with a mixture of admiration and unease. They respected his commitment. They appreciated how his violence made their jobs easier. They understood that his reputation protected the entire team. But they also recognized something unsettling. George Atkinson enjoyed the violence in ways that went beyond competitive necessity. He would watch film of his biggest hits with satisfaction. He would describe the feeling of a perfect collision with language that bordered on poetic. He would talk about the sound of impact, the sensation of dominance, the sight of an opponent crumpling to the ground. This was not a man who hit hard because the game required it. This was a man who chose football because it was the only legal outlet for something that burned inside him. The Raiders' uniform did not create George Atkinson. It simply gave him permission to be who he already was. The era of George Atkinson could not last forever. By the early 1980s, the NFL had changed dramatically. Rules protecting receivers had multiplied. Penalties for violent hits had increased. The culture of intimidation that defined 70s football was being replaced by something safer and more sanitized. George Atkinson retired after the 1977 season. He played 10 seasons in the NFL. He won a Super Bowl championship. He made the Pro Bowl. He established a legacy that continues to influence how people think about defensive football. But his true legacy cannot be measured in statistics. His true legacy lives in the nightmares of receivers who faced him. It lives in the game plans that were altered to avoid him. It lives in the rules that were created specifically because of him. George Atkinson changed the NFL not by what he achieved, but by what he represented. He represented the outer limit of acceptable violence in professional sports. He represented the line between athlete and weapon. He represented the uncomfortable truth that football is, at its core, a game built on controlled brutality. Modern fans who watch today's NFL have no concept of what George Atkinson represented. They see flags thrown for hits that would have been celebrated 50 years ago. They see ejections for contact that George Atkinson delivered multiple times per game. They see a sanitized version of football that has traded fear for safety. That is probably a good thing. The damage done to players in the 1970s was catastrophic. The long-term health consequences were devastating. The players themselves often did not understand what was happening to their brains until it was too late. But something was also lost. The NFL today is missing the primal element that made it captivating, the genuine fear that elevated every collision, the knowledge that crossing certain boundaries could result in genuine physical consequences.
George Atkinson embodied that primal element more completely than anyone who ever played. He was football at its most raw, most violent, most honest, and we will never see anything like him again. The question remains, was George Atkinson a villain or a product of his environment? The answer is complicated. The NFL created the conditions that allowed George Atkinson to thrive. The rules permitted his violence. The culture celebrated his intimidation. The Raiders franchise specifically recruited players who would push limits that other teams respected. George Atkinson was doing exactly what he was paid to do. He was doing it better than anyone else.
If that makes him a villain, then the entire sport shares responsibility for creating him. Every fan who cheered a violent hit, every coach who preached physicality, every owner who profited from the spectacle of controlled violence, they all contributed to the environment that produced George Atkinson. Blaming him alone is convenient, but it is not honest. Lynn Swan eventually returned from the concussion George Atkinson inflicted. He won Super Bowls. He made the Hall of Fame. He became a successful broadcaster and businessman after football. But he never forgot the hit. In interviews decades later, he still spoke about that moment with visible discomfort. The memory of lying on that field, consciousness stripped away by a blow he never saw coming, remained vivid. George Atkinson put something in Lynn Swan's brain that no amount of success could remove: fear. And that fear was George Atkinson's greatest accomplishment. So when someone asks you to name the most terrifying player in NFL history, do not hesitate. Do not say Lawrence Taylor. Do not say Ray Lewis. Do not say any name from the modern era where rules protect players from the darkest possibilities of this sport. Say George Atkinson, because no player in NFL history made opponents fear for their physical safety the way he did. No player in NFL history forced an entire league to rewrite its rules to contain him. No player in NFL history sued a Hall of Fame coach for calling him a criminal and walked away victorious. George Atkinson was not the biggest player. He was not the fastest. He was not the most talented. He was simply the most willing. Willing to cross lines others respected, willing to inflict damage others avoided, willing to be hated if hatred meant victory. The Oakland Raiders have had many legends, but they have only had one nightmare. Number 43, George Atkinson, the most terrifying man to ever wear an NFL uniform.